Hey everybody, Jeff Waldorf with you. Today I have a special guest. This is Paul Clements. He's running for Michigan's 6th Congressional District. You're running as a Democrat, but you're running on a similar platform to Senator Bernie Sanders, if I'm correct. Welcome to the show, Paul. So glad to have you here. Glad to have another person in Michigan who's running on progressive values. It's always good to see.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Bernie endorsed me. This is my third time to run.
Right.
He endorsed me in 2014 and in 2016. And I think that, when he decided to run for president, he said he's running on three things: economic inequality, money in politics, and climate change. And my goodness, he had it right.
Obvious first question here. You just mentioned Bernie Sanders. Is he somebody that helped you make the decision to run for office? Or what was the catalyst?
No, I'm a professor. I'm a professor of political science, but I teach national economic development and economic development theory. But I've also done a lot of work on climate change, and I'm pretty happy as a professor. But I was publishing on climate change. I started presenting on it with a number of my colleagues, and I was in the public library talking about the politics of climate change. And I said, oh, and by the way, we here in the 6th District, Michigan 6th District, we have both a responsibility and an opportunity, because our Congressman Fred Upton had recently morphed into a climate science denier when he got to be chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And that was the most powerful position in the House of Representatives on climate policy. And he basically got in bed with the Koch brothers, and he became the strongest enemy of Obama's climate action program in the House. And that's pretty bad for our country and for the world.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I was talking about climate change. I said, guess what? We here in the 6th District, if we can get rid of this guy, we can move climate, national and maybe global climate policy forward. And there was a young woman in the audience, an African-American woman, friend of mine, Stephanie Moore, and she said, Paul, you should run for Congress. So that got me thinking about it. I've sort of been concerned about economic justice for a long time.
Right.
And I've been distressed about the state of our country and the way things have been going in favor of the 1% and not working for the majority of people. But it was the climate change issue that really got me looking at it in the first place, when the LA Times called Upton Congress's #1 enemy of planet Earth. And I took that seriously.
Oh, yeah. And look, there's a lot of things to be distressed about in this country, especially now with the election of Donald Trump. But I tend to look at the election of Trump as more of a symptom rather than the disease itself. And a lot of that symptom is presented in the fact that we have huge amounts of money in politics and huge amounts of corruption. And going back to Upton, isn't it kind of funny that he just turned into a climate denier as soon as he got a powerful position? Or maybe it has to do with, I don't know, the $985,000 he received in his career from oil and gas companies, or the $1,342,000 from electric utilities. Very interesting.
And then when I was coming up against him in the polls, the Koch brothers came in, and one of their foundations put in $300,000 against me on top of the numbers you were talking about. So they had his back.
I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right?
Oh yes, of course.
Huge coincidence. Apparently, they're just very concerned about jobs, right? And greening the planet. That's that big argument. Oh, we like more carbon in the atmosphere because that just means a greener planet. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah, exactly. And a more acidic ocean, and maybe instead of just 60 million refugees and internally displaced people, maybe 200 million, and a few other little things. But yeah, a little more carbon in the atmosphere can help the plants grow.
Yeah, never hurt nobody, right? A little bit of extra carbon.
That's what they like to say.
That's what they love to say.
As long as they're selling more oil and gas, you know the story.
Absolutely. So obviously that's a huge issue. As somebody who's a professor, you've seen all sorts of arguments against climate change, and you take it very, very seriously because you've seen the science and you accept the science. And that's not the case for, obviously, Fred Upton, who was your
Well, and it's
opponent.
personal for me too. You know, I mean, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Gambia in West Africa, and that's one of the places where the Sahara Desert and the Sahel are creeping down. And friends of mine who, you know, the tradition, most people there are farmers, peanut farmers, but their peanut farms are blown away because of desertification. And the science indicates that that's one of the places that's been more badly hit than others by warming and drought. You know, and there are many places like this around the world. We've seen it in Mexico. So you know, it's friends of mine, but it's also it's an existential threat to our global political system as well. So it is a big deal. Yeah.
So yeah, I do the show 5 days a week. You know, when I'm having a good week, when I'm able to, and I'll still get comments from random people. Oh, climate change it's a hoax. It's only there to tax us. The science is muddled. You know, all that stuff. I mean, how would you convince people who are stuck in that mindset to vote for somebody who's more progressive, I should say, on not just the climate but other issues? Like, have you figured out how to reach certain people, or there are certain people that are unreachable?
Yeah. Well, no, I think there probably are about 15% of the population that are absolutely unreachable by any kind of evidence or rational argument. But I also recognize that in our public opinion, in our given the concerns of most people, that it's really the failure of our economy when we've seen 30 years of rising productivity in this country, and the benefits have gone to the very top, to the 1%, the 2% at the top, and certainly not to the people here in this district. And they know that they've been struggling economically. Certainly that's part of the motivation behind supporting Trump. You know, I've talked with a lot of people, a fair few Trump supporters, and they think that, you know, Washington's not been working for them, and they're right. It has not been working for them. Of course, Trump's making it worse, not better.
Right.
But somehow he managed to convince them otherwise.
Yeah, I kind of want to push back against the 50%. I think it's far lower, the people that you can't
I
reach.
said 15%.
Oh, 15. Okay, I misheard that. I thought you were saying
Sorry
50%.
Yeah.
I was like,
That
oh
50%
no,
would be very bad.
don't basket of deplorables this one. You know what I mean?
Right.
But no, I think you're right. That there's a certain very small minority of people where that argument doesn't, you know, it doesn't really mean anything to them, and they can rationalize it away. But as you're saying, I think most Americans, I think the number one priority, I think, is, yeah, we care about climate change, but does that, like, I can't feed my family. I can't put food on the table.
Sure.
I can't pay the rent. And I get all these conservatives, you know, that are running ads that are saying, oh, my electricity bill is going to go up. I already owe $100 this month, and I can't afford the bill. And, you know, I got to buy back to school stuff. And, you know, so like, coal's pretty cheap and oil's pretty cheap and it's been working, and climate change isn't quite here. So I can rationalize voting for somebody who's against that. And I think that's where I think a lot of people tend to fall into, is they're making immediate economic trade-offs in order to, you know, rationalize their not voting for somebody who's in favor of doing massive, bold action on climate change. And I think those are the people that you can reach with a bold economic agenda. So I want you to talk a little bit about your ideas for bringing forward that bold economic agenda, and starting what you would do on climate change to help create jobs in the 6th District.
Sure. Well, climate change, I mean, the statistics are clear that the fastest growing area of jobs in 2016 was wind power, and solar power was close behind it. You know, in terms of job creation, it's going to be the clean energy area where things are expanding, but that's not going to address the deep economic problems that we're facing. If we're asking what's holding back our economy from working for the majority of people, you know, we're talking about things like, my goodness, getting the corporation, the wealthy to pay the fair share of taxes, in order that, I mean, right now, our education system, our infrastructure, our criminal justice system, our healthcare system, they're all way behind those of other industrialized, or of some other industrialized countries. our federal government has been failing in so many areas for so long, and people are just used to it. Their expectations are so low because it hasn't been working for such a long time. But seriously, if we want to get our economy working for the majority of people, we've got to get education that works. And I mean, for me, that starts with good quality preschool for everybody. It starts with improving K through 12. That's a whole long story. It starts through dramatically improving vocational education. You know, I have like a big agenda, but I recognize that in terms of communication, like this show, I'm really grateful, Jeff, that you allow us to talk for half an hour. We can get to a deep thing. You don't get half an hour with most of the voters. So one thing I'm really talking about is vocational, because here in Michigan, there are 100,000 jobs that employers want to hire, and they don't have the qualified workforce. And most of this money comes from the Perkins program from the federal government, which has been flatlined since 2002. And now Trump wants to cut it by 15%. And people know that we don't have the nurses and the electricians and the carpenters and the computer programmers and the senior care workers. People know that we don't have these, and that vocational education is something that can speak to that. You know, I've been talking about, everyone knows that healthcare is a disaster. And, you know, Trump's proposals have made it even worse. And people know that their prescription drugs cost way too much. And my opponent, Fred Upton, is personally responsible for a number of things, like blocking the importation of generics from Canada. So moving towards single payer, which makes complete economic and structural sense. You know, spending 30 cents on the healthcare dollar for the administration, the overhead, the insurance profits, and the advertising and some pharmaceutical costs, when Canada spends 10 cents on that, that just makes no sense at all. So we can shift those resources to and have a health focus, not just a curing disease focus. And we can make our healthcare cheaper and better. So if we make healthcare cheaper and better, if we have strong vocational education, and then for a third issue that I can just easily talk to people about is, you know, Obama said that we should have our financial advisors actually have to work for the people they're advising. And now Trump wants to take that away. He says, no, they don't have to work for the people they're paid by. They can just make profits themselves. You know, it doesn't really matter who they're serving. So I think these are three sort of immediate issues that I can talk with voters about that they can easily grasp. But I'm not going to neglect the big picture, and that is to say that we have an economy that for 30 years has been working, you know, with money in politics, has been working for the 1%, the very few at the top, and to turn that one around, it's not going to happen in a day, but it's going to take a much more effective federal government in so many areas. We need to have post-secondary education that's affordable. I'd like to have it free, whether it's vocational or college, community college or public university for families with $100,000 or less. We need to refinance federal loans and student loans. That we could, you know, if the banks can do it for 0.5%, well, the students can do it for 2 or 3%. The federal government can support that, and that makes so much sense. So students can actually start their lives as economically productive and as members of the community. So there are a lot of big picture issues that we have to address if we want to get this economy working for the people again. And these are things that, you know, when I have the opportunity to give a broad perspective, but these are things I talk about. And if it's got to be more narrowly focused in a few sound bites, I have that too.
So I noticed an underlying theme is Washington's broken. Now, I agree with that. I cover the dysfunction every day. This dysfunction existed long before Donald Trump. But doesn't that argument, though, give ammunition to, I guess, certain conservative narratives of, the government's broken, Washington is corrupt, so let's just get rid of government and hand it over to the corporations? So, you know, how do you counter that argument? Because I know a lot of people in my personal life who, you know, aren't like hardcore Fox News watching conservatives. And these are people that are close to my age that are like, everything's corrupt. So what difference does it make? The entire situation, you know, Washington is just a cesspool. And what can we do about it? How do you like? Can you get through to those people?
Well, the first thing is that the reason Washington is a cesspool is because the corporations and the ultra rich have been pouring their money into it and corrupting it, and we've been allowing that for 30 years, and there are a lot of Democrats who bought into that as well as Republicans. But yeah, okay, if you want the corporations to do it, well, how well are corporations handling public education? Let's say, for example, here in Michigan, how well are corporations handling prisons? When they own the prisons, my goodness, they're feeding the inmates rotten food. You're having uprisings because they don't care. They're just there for the profit. Mm-hmm. The public schools in Michigan that are owned by corporations are, the charter schools, the public schools have been undermined for a long time, so they face some serious challenges. But the charter schools are scoring on test scores even worse than public schools that have faced so many challenges and haven't had the resources at all, have had the rug pulled out underneath them.
So let me jump in here.
Corporations aren't doing the job.
Let me jump in here about the whole public and charter school thing. I mean, our own Betsy DeVos is now education secretary. Yeah. So, and the DeVos family is huge in Michigan. And so you can't go anywhere without seeing their name plastered on some building or museum or weird piece of artwork or something like that. And so, I mean, that goes, I guess, back to the whole problem of money in politics. She essentially bought her seat on the Trump administration. Over $200 million in donations, I believe. It was one figure. There might be other donations. It might be a bigger figure. But from as far as I know, that's a big indicator of just how broken the system actually is when you can, run for, you can have an idea and, have that idea, for example, charter schools, fail completely and totally in execution and yet still wind up in the highest position in when it comes to education, just like Betsy DeVos.
And look across the board. I mean, Trump's cabinet and he can't even fill a third of the positions in his administration, and so many of his choices of people. I mean, to have a climate science denier heading the EPA, to have Betsy DeVos in education, it's just one person after another. Where it's part of the reason that people are skeptical about government, you're right, it's not, Trump is a symptom. We've had one party that since Ronald Reagan has been presenting government as the enemy and have undermined the competence of government in area after area. And then they say, oh, look, it's failing. Yeah, it is failing because you've undermined it. But the reality is that we can have limited, effective government. It's got to be smart. I actually have a PhD in public affairs, and I've been teaching national economic development. I've been looking at the countries around the world and teaching this stuff about, well, when an economy is growing, what's been going on? When an economy is failing, what's been the cause? And the strongest single variable is the competence of government. And if we look at, I gave you the example of vocational education failing. All right. Well, this is a clear area where the private sector doesn't have the perspective, doesn't have the resources to fix the vocational system. The government has to be there. We're talking about our criminal justice system. We've had this. Well, this is partly a different issue because I think here it's arisen from Nixon's so-called war on drugs, which was largely a war on people of color. But when you've got a system where you've got 2% of your population in jail or prison or probation or parole, far and away a higher proportion than any other country around the world, that means that they're costing the taxpayer. They're taken away from the community. When they're in jail, they're taught how to be better criminals for the most part, or else just kept there until they're 60 years old and they can't do anything. And it's an economic disaster. It's a social disaster. If we're here in Michigan, we're going backwards in education, largely due to people like Betsy DeVos. Our criminal justice system, they've been pushing to privatize it. They've been pushed back against it, fortunately, here in Michigan, but other places around the country, we've got to turn that one around. We have, when Obama tried to reform healthcare, he said, well, we've got to get the insurance companies and the hospitals and the doctors on board, and so he wasn't prepared to push for single payer because he thought that would be too big a jump for people. Maybe I don't know about that. but the evidence is that single payer is the right direction in terms of improving quality and reducing cost. And so if you think about our economy and it's being held back by expensive and poor health care, by weak and poorly distributed education, by expensive and ineffective criminal justice system, by infrastructure that's falling apart. And all these things are areas where to really get the positive change we need, frankly, a better central government, better federal government is the key. So yeah, we need to have a big program. And I don't believe we can do this in 2 years or 4 years, but if we don't have the vision out there, we're not going to move in that direction. And I was so proud that Bernie Sanders had that vision. And I will tell you that when I got started, running for Congress the first time, 2014, I felt a little shy about presenting what I really believed in, so I thought it was too big. But it's not too big, and our country needs it. And this idea that government is the problem if you let it be the problem. But there are plenty of examples of smart, effective government. You can measure this stuff. And I also helped to start the evaluation doctoral program and evaluations all over the world. You can build in systems that have some degree of correction. You've got to have people watching. You've got to have, the democracy. If people just stay home, then, yeah, maybe government's not going to work. But we're seeing a resurgence of public concern about the failure of our government. And if that can be sustained, then we need to have strong transparency and accountability. But if we don't do these things, then I don't see our 21st century American economy working for the people, and that would be an utter disaster.
So, okay, I have another question. So, we talk a lot about, the conservative failure of the last, 30 years.
Yes.
We've got specific Supreme Court cases that just introduced a flood of money into our political system.
Yeah.
You have Buckley Vallejo, you have Bellotti versus First Bank, which basically made money speech and then allowed corporations to have the speech. And we have Citizens United that followed in its wake, which really is just a logical extension of those two Supreme Court decisions. So that opened up the money, the floodgates of money into our system. And that's sort of what we see today. But you can't go and completely look at Republicans simply for that, because there is some fault to blame on the Democratic side.
Oh, certainly, no question. And there are plenty of Democrats, who've been playing the big money game long enough, and that's what they're accustomed to, and they're happy to keep that going. So getting free airtime on TV and radio for the main candidates, and having complete transparency in any kind of financial contribution or political spending, and maybe having limits on what more serious limits, or maybe there's some good ideas out there about candidates who don't accept money above a certain level, or don't accept certain kinds of money, that they might get their small dollar contributions doubled or tripled. There are a number of ways to do this, but the Democratic Party has not been a strong proponent of these things, and we need to turn that one around too, for sure. Now's a time where, if we're going to address the challenges our country faces to get this economy working for the majority of people, for the middle class, for the poor, not just for the 1%, it's going to take a lot.
Mm-hmm. And it will take a lot. There's definitely a lot of pushback from establishment, more mainline Democrats, who do take a lot of money from these corporations, these super PACs, and these special interests. And so, I mean, there's always that concern when you look and see a certain position. For example, when you look at Democrats that don't support things like Medicare for all, and all you have to really do is just look and see where he's getting the money, or he or she, and it's like that movie. You follow the money, Lebowski, the Big Lebowski. You got to follow the money. You got to follow the money, and normally that money.
I think Watergate was involved in that one, huh?
Yeah, money always.
The money trail.
Always follow the money trail, exactly, because it will lead you back to who is really pulling the strings when it comes to the people who are pushing these policies, or who are fighting back against these progressive policies. I mean, let's go back to. I know I talk about Democrats, But let's talk about your Republican opponent, Fred Upton. He's taken over $1.5 million from health professionals, and over $1.4 million from pharmaceutical companies. So this guy, he's very, very well funded. And you went up against him twice before. In 2014, you got 40% of the vote. In 2016, you got 36% of the vote. My guess is that you were outspent massively in those races.
Yeah, I was outspent about 3-1. But in addition to that, Upton is able to get enormous free publicity. He's on the news, and he knows he's got real challenge here. And at that time, he was chair of Energy and Commerce Committee. Now he's still the senior Republican in the Michigan delegation. So he's able to get a lot of free media, and he's kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing. He presents himself almost every time he speaks. He uses the word bipartisan, and he will work with some people on stuff like cleaning up the Great Lakes and stuff like that. But my goodness, he's voting 97% plus with Trump. On the health care bill, he was personally responsible for the Republican health care bill passing the House of Representatives. This was back in March or April when the Republican bill, they didn't know if they were going to get through the House. And at first he was opposing it, and people here in the district were saying, my goodness, yes, Fred, finally you're standing up for us. But that only lasted 36 hours. And Trump called him in, and Trump said, well, we'll give you $8 million for pre-existing conditions, when the real cost of dealing with pre-existing conditions would be $100 billion. And when it doesn't begin to address the issue with taking Medicare away from about 40,000 people here in our district, and Upton folded. And that opened the eyes of so many people here in this district that he's willing to push a bill that's going to give enormous tax breaks to millionaires and take health care away from 40,000 of our neighbors and my friends, and raise the cost for so many others. So that made him vulnerable in a way that he hasn't been before. He's been unwilling. He has not held an open town hall meeting for over a decade. He was not willing to debate me in a public debate. And these are things that have gone under the radar until recently. But now a lot of people, with the Trump presidency, it's a disaster for the country. But the silver lining is that there is incredible progressive energy, certainly here in my district. And I think we're seeing it around the country. And the idea now that someone would go 10 years without holding an open town hall meeting, that's just unacceptable, and it's been unacceptable. But now people are recognizing it and bringing it to the attention of the press, and the media here in my district is paying attention for the first time. So he's had a lot of money. He's been around for a long time. He presents himself as this bipartisan guy, but his voting record is absolutely the opposite of that, and it's raising the cost of prescription medicines. It's he was one of the people, as chair of Energy and Commerce Committee, who was personally responsible for pushing these 60 different votes against the Affordable Health Care Act, trying to block it. So again, he's been working for 7 or 8 years tirelessly to block the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. And then when it finally fails in the Senate, he says, okay, now let's get together and work on it in a bipartisan way, when there's really no real chance that that's going to happen and really move forward, given the broader politics. And that's an example of how Upton, really tries to play both sides of the fence. So we're holding him accountable for that now.
So it's more of a presentation of, hey, look at me, I'm a Republican moderate. I'm not like that. I'm not like these guys. I'm interested in bipartisanship. We've seen that shtick before, and we especially seen it for from Democrats, and they're rarely successful. I think that's something that's different between the Republicans and Democrats. Not to get off in too big of a tangent, is that Republicans aren't afraid to primary each other, whereas I think a lot of the Democrats seem to be a little bit more afraid. But people like Upton generally don't last very long as far as trying to act moderate or to actually vote on moderate issues. But as you pointed out, Upton is far from moderate. He's actually incredibly pro-Trump conservative. So, and now people are starting to find out. It is kind of amazing that he hasn't held a town hall in 10 years. That's crazy. Yeah. That's crazy. So and no wonder I didn't hear
tomorrow night I'm going to, they're having a puppet town hall. They're going to have a puppet Upton. We've got a former congressman from a nearby district, Mark Shower, who's put this one on. But just to sort of demonstrate in a creative way what we don't see with the puppet Upton. Mm-hmm. I don't know how it's going to happen. I've not been involved in organizing it, but I'm going to be there tomorrow night.
Should be very interesting. So if you could give people some details on that when we close out the show. But one more thing. So you talked a lot about your district, right? So what are some of the issues, or I should say, what is the most important issue that you've heard from your the people that you want to represent in your district? The thing that they most care about.
I really think it's that this is one of the areas, like many in the country, where we've actually had a declining median wage, where we have families where you have two people working and they still sometimes have trouble putting food on the table, or they're making choices between food and clothing. It's still the economy not working for most people that is the key piece of that. And obviously healthcare, when so many people are paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars for prescription drugs, and again, Upton's been responsible for that. They see the connection there. So it's still the economy that is overwhelmingly the most immediate, heartfelt concern for most of my voters, and so that's certainly what I'm focusing on in my speeches and in the campaign that I'm building. And frankly, when I get to Congress, that's what I'm going to work on.
All right. Okay. So that's really all I have for questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, like something for our viewers?
Well, I have a big picture on this. I will say that I got my first degree at Harvard, and I got a PhD in public affairs at Princeton. And you look around the world, and the world needs the American democracy to work right now. We see the failures in the area of addressing climate change. We see the failures in the area of addressing the rising tide of, right now we have starvation and refugees and internally displaced people. But more broadly than that, we don't see positive movement in the area of democracy. And I think that we've got to show how it works. We've got to make our democracy work here at home really effectively. So it works, of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if we don't do that, then I think that we in the world are going to be in deep trouble for the 21st century. So it does take big vision. Yes, to win elections, we've got to focus on the immediate bread and butter issues facing our constituents. And that makes sense. I get that. But if we don't deal with money and politics, with climate change, with the fundamental causes of economic inequality, then the world's in deep trouble, and we're going to be in continued deep trouble. Now, my campaign website, which has a donate button, of course, is clementsforcongress.com. You can look me up on Facebook. Please like me at Clements for Congress. The Twitter is at Clem for the digit 4. The other ones are FOR, but the Facebook, it's Clem digit 4 Congress. Because we need people in Congress who are going to push for the fundamental changes that will make our economy work for the people and that will restore our democracy.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.